Welcome to a special episode of The Truths with me. What do you mean we can't call it that? Because Russell Brand has copyrighted the name, so? He might sue me. Well, I'm fairly sure that the anti-capitalism activist who advocates a revolution against corporate tyranny and preaches a cooperative economic system where people share resources is not going to sue me to make sure I don't use the word truths in some YouTube video that will only get 20 views, is he? I've probably increased his brand awareness, if anything. Yeah, a bit cheesy that one, just cut it out later. Yeah, anyway, if like me, you've been watching the election debates, you probably saw what happened when Labour leader and wannabe Prime Minister Ed Miliband tried to answer this question about Labour spending.
A really simple question.
Yeah.
Do you accept that when Labour was last in power, it overspent?
No, I don't. And I know you may not agree with that. But let me just say very clearly...
Even with all the borrowing, year on year on year?
No, I don't. Let me tell you.
His answer that the UK was in a global financial crisis that caused the deficit to rise here, just as it did in the USA, prompted this response from a member of the audience.
You talk about this global financial crisis. Australia didn't suffer this. Canada didn't suffer this. Some of the other major countries didn't suffer. This country suffered because Gordon Brown sold gold just to prop up the social services. How can you stand there and say you didn't overspend and end up bankrupting this country? That is absolutely ludicrous. You're frankly just lying. Sorry.
I guess I'm not going to convince you, but...
Well, you're not going to convince me, because the facts speak for themselves. You stood there and said you didn't overspend. If I get to the end of the week and I can't afford to buy a pint, I've overspent. It means I haven't got any money left.
Sure.
Strong claim there, and the same guy has since written an article for the Mail repeating his claim that Labour overspent and bankrupted Britain, and that Miliband is lying by claiming that the global financial crisis is what resulted in a high debt and a high deficit. So who's right, Ed Miliband or Adrian Gill from Leeds? And you might be asking, why do I care? Well, there's three people that motivated me to make this video, and the first is Adrian Gill. His anger is clearly genuine, but he's also so obviously wrong about everything. Next, the Tories for pushing this idea that Labour crashed the economy and that things would have been different if they were in power. And finally, Ed Miliband and Labour for being so utterly shit and ineffective at defending their record on the economy. The sole purpose of this video is to reply to Mr. Gill with as many facts as possible and point out how unfounded and nonsensical some of his comments are. His first point is that Australia did not suffer in the global financial crisis. The fact that we refer to it as the global financial crisis implies that it affected the entire globe. Now, Jennifer Hill, who is a professor of corporate law, writes that although the impact of the financial crisis was less severe than in the UK and US, it cannot be said that Australia escaped the crisis unscathed. The Australian stock market fell in value by over $700 billion, and there were many high-profile business collapses. It's also worth pointing out that Australia has had a mining boom since 2005, fueled by demand from China and India for its natural resources, resources the UK does not possess, and it's this demand that helps shield Australia from the full force of the crisis. His rant continues by claiming that the UK suffered because Gordon Brown sold off our gold reserves to prop up social services, and in one sentence he's actually made two glaring errors. Brown sold off 400 tonnes of gold for £2 billion, which today would be worth over £13 billion, and at first glance, selling off any asset for 6 times less than what you could have got for it doesn't seem smart. But did the UK suffer as a result? Alan Beattie in the Financial Times points out that money we'd have raised if we waited until the gold price was higher would only have covered 3 weeks of our annual deficit. Hardly pivotal, as he says. Taking this into account makes the claim that the UK suffered because of the gold sale seem bizarre, but it's not the last bizarre claim that we will address. Did Brown use the money to prop up social services? Well, £2 billion over 3 years is not really that much when it comes to government spending and wouldn't have propped up anything for any considerable length of time. Moving on to his article, he writes that, "I've been a financial advisor for the last 20 years or so. I deal more with hard-working savers trying to be prudent with their income and nest eggs. The sums I deal with may be peanuts to the billions and trillions that Mr. Miliband and Gordon Brown splashed around, but actually the principles are exactly the same. Now, it's interesting what he does here, because straight away he's presenting his credentials to show why he's not just some random mouthy bloke from a Question Time audience, but actually someone knowledgeable and informed that knows what he's talking about. Well, for starters, a financial advisor is worlds away from an economist. Being able to offer financial advice to one person on how much of their salary they spend and save is not even in the same league as trying to understand how the individual finances of the population contribute to and affect the national economy, supply and demand, business cycles, inflation, interest rates, monetary policy, fiscal policy, and loads of other technical terms I pasted from Wikipedia. Secondly, the nest egg he talks about implies that someone is saving for their retirement. Well, it's obviously escaped his attention that the UK has been around for about 300 years and countries do not retire. In fact, this whole idea of comparing government finances and budgets with a household budget is stupid. The notion that the principles are the same is ludicrous. He continues by saying, "As I suggested to the Labour leader, if I get to the end of the week and find I don't have enough money for a pint, then I've spent too much." He apparently was so pleased with this line from Question Time that he recycled it in his article. It was ridiculous on TV and equally ridiculous in the Mail. Nobody really needs a pint. Once it's gone, it's gone. You get some short-term satisfaction from it, but there are no long-term benefits and no potential return. When a government chooses to spend money on building things, schools, hospitals or roads, then it expects the investment will pay off long-term. The money spent on its construction projects will trickle down into the rest of the economy and continue to provide a benefit when complete. So yeah, comparing the purchase of a pint down his local with government spending is pretty silly. He then says in relation to spending too much, "Simple, but when I asked him to accept that's what the last Labour government did, he just refused to do so. Rather than admit that, he lied." Did Labour spend too much? Well, Mark Blythe, who is Professor of Political Economy at Brown University and author of a really excellent book, Austerity, History of a Dangerous Idea, writes in Chapter 3, "It's true that Europe, especially the countries that use the euro, is not in great fiscal health. But as in the US, it is not true that this came about through an orgy of public borrowing and spending. Only in the case of Greece is the overspending story plausible. It simply doesn't apply to the other European states." So Adrian Gill, a financial advisor in Leeds who gives people advice on mortgages and pensions, says that Labour spent too much. Yet Mark Blythe, Ivy League professor, published author of a book which examines the global financial crisis, its causes and government efforts to resolve the crisis through austerity measures, disagrees. So who do we think is the authority on this topic? The reality is UK debt to GDP was 43% in 2007 versus 67% in Germany and 107% in Greece. Labour actually had a 3.5% surplus in 2000 and ran a deficit of between 2% and 3.4% until the crisis hit. He and his henchman Ed Balls want to perpetuate the myth that the economy went bankrupt solely as a result of the global financial crisis. Now, this was a crisis that started in the USA in 2007 and reached Europe by 2008. The UK banking system, just as in the US, almost collapsed, and this had a knock-on effect on UK GDP. Lower bank revenue equals lower tax revenue from the banks, which equals lower GDP. That means the debt to GDP ratio gets worse, even if the actual amount of debt stays the same. The Labour government then had to bail out the banks by injecting them with cash. In December 2013, the National Audit Office said that the amount borrowed by the government to support banks had reached £124 billion since 2009. So that's £124 billion of additional debt being added onto the UK debt total in order to save the banks. So first, the UK GDP falls, which makes debt to GDP worse. Then we add more debt to save the banks, which makes the debt to GDP ratio even worse again. Next, we have to factor in the impact on the economy when the crisis spread from the banking sector to other industries. People started losing their jobs and welfare spending had to be increased as a result. This vicious cycle of falling revenue and increased spending and borrowing is the reason why our debt to GDP ratio and deficit spiked. The debt to GDP ratio of 43% in 2007 became 78.4% by 2010, and a deficit of 2.8% was 11.4% by 2009. It should be clearly obvious to anyone with any intelligence that the worst debt to GDP ratio and higher deficit were a symptom of the crisis, not the cause. Now, was the UK actually bankrupt or close to bankruptcy? Well, the UK, unlike Greece and every other Eurozone country, has its own currency and its own central bank, which means it can literally print money. Within reason, of course, but just like his pint analogy, the idea that the UK was bankrupt is laughable. And I'm starting to detect a trend here. Would the UK have still gone bust without it? The answer is yes. Now hang on. What other kind of cataclysmic event could have almost caused some of our biggest banks to almost go out of business, shattered confidence in the economy, caused tax revenues to plummet, increased borrowing to save the aforementioned banking institutions, and caused spending on welfare and benefits to rise? Now, this is pure speculation on his part, and he doesn't even try to offer any kind of alternative potential disaster that could have wrecked the country's finances like the banking crisis did. They appear to be able to put the blinkers on and forget that they spent 13 years in power buying the public vote with unfunded, unaffordable spending. Well, in 1996, the Tory government had a deficit of 4.3%, and Labour turned this into a surplus of 3.5% by the year 2000. So basically, they spent their first 3 years in office wiping out a Tory deficit, which hardly sounds reckless to me. Regardless who came up with the spending plans, the statement of 13 years reckless spending is clearly not true if 3 out of 13 was spent building up a surplus. As for buying the public vote with spending, isn't trying to stay in power what all parties do? No party spends money to try and actively piss people off. I think I'm bored of being Prime Minister. How can we make sure people don't vote for us? How about we build giant penis-shaped statues in every town centre? That'll piss people off. Bloody brilliant idea. Mr Gill is also unaware that George Osborne pledged to match Labour spending in 2007, so the Tories clearly disagreed with his assessment that Labour spending was unfunded and unaffordable. It's a fact that UK governments have ran deficits for 83 of the last 100 years. Budget surpluses are the exception, not the rule. Any government that runs a prolonged budget surplus would surely come under pressure from its electorate to A, reduce taxes, and B, start spending. But if bankers must take more responsibility, so must the Labour government that apparently had no provision in place to sustain it through such a crisis. He's actually right here. The Labour government should take more responsibility, so too should the Tories and every politician in every country that was affected by the crisis. And those aren't my words, they're Marvin King's, and he was the governor of the Bank of England at the time. The reality is, nobody saw the crisis coming, and Labour just happened to be running a budget deficit at the time. Things would have been no different under the Tories. On Thursday, David Cameron produced the no money left letter that former Treasury Minister Liam Byrne bequeathed to his coalition successor. Clearly, Liam Byrne will regret writing that note. He'll never be allowed to forget it. Was it a stupid thing to write? Yes. Did it show a remarkable lack of foresight to leave it behind for the person from your political opposition who was succeeding you? Yes. Would Labour weaponise such a note if given opportunity? Of course. Was it meant to be taken literally? Probably not. After 5 years of this government, we're seeing green shoots of recovery all over the country. But these green shoots can easily wither. As any gardener knows, one sharp frost can kill things off overnight. I'm afraid Mr Miliband is that sharp frost. He would kill this country's economy overnight. Man, this guy really loves his metaphors and analogies. We've now gone from comparing government spending to a pint down the pub to comparing the state of the economy with his vegetable patch. Regardless, opinion on how much of recovery the UK has had remains a controversial subject. We all know about the 900,000 people using food banks and recent analysis that says living standards fell for everyone but the very rich. Mr Miliband's only apparent acknowledgement of any failings was the recognition that Labour had relied too heavily on the financial sector. Now, despite his financial advisor credentials, he's obviously unaware that the banking sector exploded in the 1980s after Thatcher began relaxing regulation. According to the Financial Times, she was warned by her own ministers about the potential for banking fraud and unethical behaviour, as well as the potential for boom and bust economic cycles. I'm sure that there are lots of people out there who will disagree with my vision for the future and argue that we can't change the past. Well, it's a vision for the future that's based on a completely misguided and uninformed view of the past. And he's right in that we can't change the past. It doesn't matter how much politicians try and spin things, the historical data is readily available, which makes it easy to fact check everything that politicians claim and debunk stupid articles that appear in the tabloids. To sum up, blaming the crisis on Labour is economically illiterate. It would have happened regardless of who was in charge. Yes, Labour should have regulated the banks better, but the deregulation was started by the Tories. So yeah, subscribe here for more videos. Actually, I'm not even sure if I'll do any more. I don't know how Brand knocks out a video a day. It's bloody hard trying to be funny and factual. So yeah, subscribe if you want, but you're probably just as likely to get videos of me at the gym as you are more brilliantly researched videos such as this one. Good night.
One each.